So now I'm going to invite Dr. Alison Cook and Dr. Chris Elliott, Dr. Chris Gibson, and now Professor Shervanthe Vanasinkam and Jeremy Taylor to the platform. Well, it's a great pleasure to introduce this panel, which is now going to address society and medical technologies, and in particular horizon scanning and technology timelines. This is our third, it's our final session, and the whole purpose is indeed to do some horizon scanning with the help of these experts that we have here. So first of all, may I introduce Dr. Alison Cook. Maybe Alison, you just put your hand up, but I think we can recognize you.
Oh, yeah.
Who's the Associate Director of the National Institute for Health Research, the Horizon Scanning Centre. And that centre provides policymakers with advance notice of new and emerging health technologies that may impact upon the National Health Service in the next 2 to 3 years. And Alison is head of the medical technology team that investigates innovative medical devices, imaging modalities, diagnostics, and surgical procedures. And then Dr. Chris Elliott doesn't need any further introduction. He's already in tune with his audience. And Dr. Chris Gibson, Scientific Director for the National Health Service, South of England Central. Chris is also the Deputy Head and Professional Lead for Physical Sciences of the National School of Healthcare Science. And this is a new system set up to ensure that patients benefit from the scientific and technical advances, such as the ones we have heard about earlier, by ensuring that healthcare science staff have the knowledge and skills to put these advances into practice. And then, from the University of Leeds Medical School, we have Professor Vanasinkam, a consultant and vascular surgeon. And she's another member of the Academy's panel for biomedical engineering, and she is, as I said earlier, a full-time vascular surgeon. And in addition to her clinical work, she's been the principal investigator for many clinical trials, and more recently, Shervanthe has been associated with emerging technologies and their application in healthcare. And then finally, Jeremy Taylor, who is the Chief Executive of National Voices. Jeremy runs the National Coalition of Health and Care Charities in England that works to strengthen the voice of patient, service users and carers. So you can see we have a very broad church represented up here in the medical world today. Now I'm going to invite each panelist to speak for around 3 minutes about their views on the future of the medical technology industry, and specifically on what the consumer, the patient, can expect to see in the next 5 to 10 years. So I'm going to start from left to right, and I think we're going back to you, Chris, on the port side.
Okay, thank you. Apologise for hearing me twice.
Let us give the panel a warm welcome.
I was originally only supposed to be doing this session, and I offered to cover a gap in the previous one, so my apologies. And also, Lionel dropped me in it when he did his keynote by telling me what I'm going to talk about, so I've chucked away those notes as well. I just want to say something about technologies that might have a major impact on medicine. And by technologies, I mean very, very widely the toolbox that we have as engineers, ways of working. So I just wanted to take a few examples of what, paraphrase Monty Python, what have the engineers done for us? Well, a few things we might do. There's an old definition of engineers. An engineer can do for a dime what any fool can do for a dollar. So one of the areas I think we do have a lot to contribute is in squeezing out cost. We know about engineering systems to get cost down. We're in the academy, so let me plug first of all an academy publication, Creating Systems That Work. Set out 6 principles that try to answer questions like, why was Arsenal's Emirates Stadium delivered on time and cost, and Wembley Stadium wasn't? Now, if you can understand that, then maybe you can apply the same principles in health. I mentioned earlier the insertion about the banking analogy, that I can access my bank account anywhere in the world. But when I moved to Switzerland, registered with a new GP, she couldn't see my notes from my GP in the UK, so I had to take a whole new history. Can't even do it within one country, never mind. There's a lot of things that we do in engineering that are portable. But just the one I was going to touch on is safety. When I leave this evening, I'm flying back home. Risk of me dying in a plane crash from here to Geneva, 1 in 10 million, roughly. Planes aren't very safe, not intrinsically. Aluminium tube at 30,000 feet is not a good place to be. But we've spent 100 years engineering safety in, and especially by learning from every accident. If I went to hospital instead of flying, like, what's the chance of dying in surgery? 1 in a few hundred, compared to 1 in 10 million. Ian Kennedy, I think, in the BRI report, estimated that the National Health Service, or the health industry in the UK, kills 1 patient every 30 minutes by mistake. Compare that with 1 every 3 years on the railways for passengers. So we've got a lot to do with the safety experience in engineering, which I hope we could share with the medical community. It's one of the things I can see rolling forward. 2 things then. The thing was mentioned earlier, the Joint Academy's report with the Academy of Medical Sciences talks about use of safety cases, how to develop systematic safety models. And the one that Lionel trailed, which is why I've changed this, there's a Spanish proverb that only a donkey makes the same mistake twice, and even he learns by the 3rd time. It seems to me one of the great tragedies if somebody dies because it's a new procedure being tested, that's very sad. If a second person dies who didn't learn the lesson, that's tragic. Now, we have in the engineering world, particularly in transport, a history of accident investigation and learning, which is non-self-incriminating. By law, it's protected. And one of the things I'm working with some surgeons now to work up an argument for an equivalent piece of legislation in the UK so that surgeons can safely report the outcome of their first-in-man trial of a new procedure without incriminating themselves, and then maybe their colleagues can learn from it. So I think one of the big areas I think we can transplant from engineering into medicine is learning about the systematic management of safety.
Thank you very much indeed, Chris. Now we'll go to Dr. Alison Cook.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much for inviting the Horizon Scanning Centre here today. I'm painfully aware that I'm neither an engineer nor a professor, but I'll do my best. I need to be clear that the Horizon Scanning Centre works on a 2 to 3 year remit, so we're looking at things that are coming 2 to 3 years. So the 5 to 10 is slightly outside of our remit, although we obviously do have a few things that we're keeping our eye on. I think for people that are interested in looking to that 10, 20 and even beyond, I would recommend the Horizon Scanning Centre at the Department of Business Innovation and Skills. They have a Futures project which they recently updated, and they're telling us what's coming in the next 20 years. And also the King's Fund has a Medical Advances section, which is very, very interesting to see what's coming there. However, even though we do sort of deal 2 to 3 years, we're currently monitoring about 300 medtech technologies, some of which I'm aware are going to be further off than our 2 to 3 years. And I just thought I'd talk really briefly about 3 of them that I just find particularly interesting. First of all, we've got the artificial pancreas, or a fully closed loop system for type 1 diabetes. Now, this is considered by many to be the ideal management strategy for patients with type 1 diabetes. It would consist of 3 components: an insulin pump, a continuous glucose monitor, and some small computing device. 2 types are being made, a reactive and a predictive one, and there is a huge amount of research going on around the world, led by the Juvenile Diabetes Foundation. There are some commercial developers. It's some way off coming into practice. All the component bits exist, but someone needs to take the money and go and put all the bits together. And also there still needs to be some advance in technology. But in theory, this could revolutionise the treatment of type 1 diabetes. So we're keeping an eye on the artificial pancreas. The second one I thought I'd just mention really briefly is artificial sight or visual prosthetics. So at Horizon Scanning Centre, we've written the first generation of these devices. So if you go onto our website, you can see a really nice little report, very brief little report, on the first epiretinal device, which is called Argus 2. And we've also just written the first subretinal device, which is called Alpha IMS. Now, these are both for retinitis pigmentosa, and they're the first generation of devices. Again, there's an awful lot of research being done around the world, and these devices are just going to get better and better and better as technology improves. For instance, we're following a US company who are developing an intraocular implant which consists of human cells which have been genetically modified to secrete a nerve growth factor so as to resuscitate damaged retinal cells. And at Cornell, they're developing an artificial retina which has the capacity to reproduce normal vision. So rather than increasing the number of electrodes placed in the eye, which a lot of research groups are doing, to capture more information, this work focuses on the quality of the signals themselves so as to improve their ability to carry impulses to the brain. So artificial sight, quite exciting. And the last one I thought I'd mention, which is absolutely huge, is stem cells. Now, where are we now? Well, today, transplantation of stem cells from bone marrow, umbilical cord blood and peripheral blood for the treatment of hematopoietic diseases is probably the only safe, controlled stem cell-based therapy in use. Now, in the last 10 years, the public has really, the imagination of the public through the media push has really captured imagination, and combined with a huge amount of research. I think there's research all around the world, and they're trying this in practically every single type of debilitating disease. There are problems, there are challenges. The studies are of varying quality, and despite tremendous enthusiasm, a lot of it is still generally inconclusive. We need a lot of money to push these through. But if you look on the King's Fund website, which I had to do because, as I said, it's a little bit outside my remit, they say that the ability to reprogram heart cells could be achieved within 10 years, and other cell types, such as liver and pancreas, within 20. And I think the great therapeutic hope with stem cells is embryonic stem cells, which they've now just started to put into mice. They've restored sight in mice, and they've treated heart failure in mice, and they're now going to start translating that into humans. So if the huge amount of investment can continue and the ethical issues around embryonic stem cells can be overcome, keep your eye on stem cells. So that's just 3 out of thousands I just chose to talk about.
Thank you very much indeed. I think we'll go right to the port side to Professor Vanna Senkam and hear from you.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm going to keep my remit to the scope and hope of regenerative medicine. I'm practicing vascular surgery. I practice solely in the NHS. I don't do any private practice, and maybe a surgeon who does no private practice is an oxymoron, but I'm one of them. I am therefore quite passionate about the NHS. I think you've got one of the best health services in the world. We have huge and growing challenges, but I think every one of those challenges gives us an opportunity to find some very different solutions. And I feel very privileged to be a clinician and a clinician scientist working in the NHS in the United Kingdom. Some of you might not, it's not hard to guess that originally I come from Sri Lanka. With a name like that, I did my high school in medicine in India, and I continue to work very actively in what people call the third world, and I call the two-thirds world. That's where most people live. In terms of regenerative medicine, we have come quite a long way. I know there's a lot of hype associated with it, but in my particular specialty, which is vascular surgery, we are involved in clinical trials looking at types of cellular therapy for critical limb ischemia, where patients with very advanced peripheral vascular disease who have no revascularization strategies, we're looking at the injection of cells to try and form vascularized networks. I think the hope really is about moving it from the one-to-one, which is the autologous cell therapy, to the one-to-many or allogenic stem cell therapy. And I think there the challenges are obviously the rejection, and I'm working very closely with industry, and we have come a long way. We're very close to clinical trial for an allogenic cell therapy for critical limb ischemia. It has already been trialed in early studies in stroke with very promising results. So I think what I'm trying to say is that the cup is half full. I'm a vascular surgeon after all, so I'm an optimist by trade. You have to be in vascular surgery. But I think what we really do need, we saw earlier the call to engage with industry, to engage with our stakeholders, which is our patients and their families and communities. And I must put my hand up as a clinician. I think we deal with the patients in the hospital, but there's a lot more work to do out in the community, excuse me, once the patients leave the hospital. I'm very heartened by the fact that a number of my clinical colleagues have joined with me. We have recently had a large grant from the NIHR to look at a theranostic device in diabetic ulcer patients, and the patient advocacy groups with whom we are working have been tremendously helpful in showing us the way forward. So as I say, I'm optimistic. I think we do need to form meaningful partnerships, powerful partnerships and consortia, and together I have absolutely no doubt that we will continue to provide an improved healthcare delivery service to our patients. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor. And now I think we will turn to Dr. Chris Gibson from the NHS South of England.
Thanks, John. We've heard very many excellent presentations today outlining some of the drivers for technological change. And I think it's worth just reviewing a couple of those. On the demand side, there's the demographic change, the ageing population, and there's also the patient expectation and indeed patient engagement in all aspects of their care. On the supply side, there's technological developments and economic pressures, seen as a problem, but the UK, of course, is a leader in life sciences. It's one of our strengths, and at times of economic pressure, it's good to play to your strengths. So I've picked out 3 areas where I think we will see innovation and development within the NHS. The first of them, I'm a little bit surprised it hasn't been mentioned. One speaker has used the phrase stratified medicine, but from the perspective of the regional scientific directors in the NHS, we see genomics and genetic profiling as one of the biggest single impacts in all of healthcare. The phrase pharmacogenetics is pretty widely used now. It means if you know the patient's genetic makeup, you will know what kind of response they will have to particular drugs. And we're already seeing the regulators only approve certain drugs if genetic testing is also being undertaken to identify the patients who will benefit. I'd like to coin a neologism for today, physicogenetics. If we knew the patient's genetic makeup, we might also be able to predict their response to physical therapies, such as radiotherapy or implants or others. And I think there's no doubt at all that that will have a very significant impact on all of our healthcare provision in the future. I want to pick out 2 other areas where I think we can see technological developments taken up by the NHS. The first will still be hospital-based. There'll still be innovations in that big technology that has to be in the hospital. And you can think of imaging or radiotherapy or robotic surgery. There will be developments in that area, particularly I think in multimodality imaging. We saw some great examples of that earlier, of putting real data on top of virtual data using something like Google Glasses or equivalent. But I'm more excited about what you might call personal or community-based technologies. And I concur with everything that's been said about the pressures that will lead to the NHS having to respond to individuals having more information about their own healthcare. We will all be living with a long-term condition as we get older. We can think of that in terms of enhanced point-of-care testing, wearable and home monitoring of your condition, smart systems using smart iPhones. Neuroprosthetics has been mentioned, artificial retinas. We've had tremendous success in the NHS with cochlear implants. I think there's scope for an awful lot of neuroprosthetics as well as physical prosthetics. So, what's the NHS doing about this in terms of education and training? And in particular, what's the National School of Healthcare Science doing? You may or may not know that the NHS in England employs about 50,000 healthcare scientists. In fact, it's probably the biggest single employer in the life sciences sector of scientists. About 5,000 of those are operating at a level which would be equivalent to chartered engineer or chartered scientist. And my day job with the National School of Healthcare Science is to make sure that we provide training for people coming into the NHS that will fit them for this technological future. Going to those three areas I picked out, firstly in terms of genomics, all healthcare scientists, no matter what specialism, and that includes clinical engineers and medical physicists, will be receiving training in genetics and genomics. And you possibly have heard the announcements about the 100,000 Genome Project. That will include, funding for that includes an element of education and training for the whole healthcare workforce, not just scientists. We're introducing a new specialism of bioinformatics to bring some of the data analysis techniques that physical scientists and engineers are so good at to the masses of data generated by modern DNA screening and profiling. And in fact, tomorrow I'm interviewing in Birmingham for the first cohort of bioinformaticians to join the NHS. Only 10 of them, but the forerunners, I think, of a new breed of people who will do what David Willett said of matching the dry science of physics and engineering with the wet science of genetics and biochemistry. The big challenge for us, I think, is in those very exciting personal and community-based technologies. Last year, only 10 hospitals in England said they wanted to take on a trainee clinical engineer. That's a real pity, I think, and there's a whole raft of work that we need to do to engage those involved in workforce planning. We need a lot more flexibility here so that we can bring in people from academia, people who've been working with colleagues like Lionel Tarasenko and so on, and get them to also have a direct clinical role in the NHS. Finally, I just want to make a comment about the future shape of the healthcare science workforce. Part of the whole progress of modernising scientific careers is about establishing senior scientists in leadership roles. Many people like myself have worked at consultant clinical scientist level for a number of years, but for the first time we're going to make that a formal registration process and introduce a formal training scheme called Higher Specialist Scientific Training. That's being done in conjunction with all the medical royal colleges, so that just as life science colleagues at the moment can be FRC Path, I foresee a time when clinical engineering colleagues can be FRCS or perhaps FRCP. And that higher specialist scientific training programme will also be rolled out for the first time this year.
Thank you very much indeed. That was excellent. Now let us move to our final speaker, to Jeremy Taylor, and we come very close to the patient.
Thank you very much. I'm not a professor or an engineer or a scientist or a very good crystal ball gazer, so I'm really sorry that you got me for your last speaker. And much of my thunder has been stolen, but there are some points that I think haven't really been made or made in the way that I would make them. Yeah, the typical patient now in the UK is 75 plus, with several things wrong with them, needing care from a number of different places. And actually, many of their needs can be served by high technology, but many of their needs increasingly need to be met in quite traditional, old-fashioned, low-tech ways. So people need good care and support. They need social contact. We know that social isolation is a big factor in poor health. And the biggest predictor of how long somebody will live and how well they will live is actually their social class. So health inequalities and public health are a big part of the picture. I think you could see the 20th century as the high point of the medical model of care, with huge important technological innovations like x-rays, like vaccines, like antibiotics, like anesthesia, that transformed the way in which doctors were able to do things to patients as passive recipients that help them to live longer, that save their lives. And I think there's still more we can do in that area. But the world that I live in is the world of people struggling to live well and indeed die well as they get older and have more things wrong with them. I think the 21st century is going to see the rise not of the medical model of care, but what I would call the social and relational model of care, personalised, coordinated, bringing together technology with the human touch. And the emblematic technologies for me, I think, are going to be things like the electronic shareable health record, the internet, the smartphone, the ingestible devices, some of the things we've been talking about today. I'm not a good crystal ball gazer, but we do seem to be living in a world of almost permanent austerity in the so-called developed world, and there doesn't seem to be an end in sight. And so everything that Robin was saying about the need for frugal innovation, I thought actually that really applies to us too. So we are going to have to, I think, rely more on low-cost technologies, not just state-of-the-art, cutting-edge, high-cost technologies, and maybe the smartphone is the single emblem of what that will look like, but there will be others too. I think we're going to have to think about low-cost drugs, because one of the interesting things about the pharmaceutical industry is that it hasn't followed the trend of other industries where you get higher quality for lower cost over time. What we get is higher cost and questionable increases in quality over time. And I think we're going to have to probably re-examine how we do the whole process of bringing drugs from the laboratory to people's bathroom cabinets. The other thing that really struck me about Robin's presentation was the need for a larger, less expensive, reliable workforce. She was talking about conditions in the developing world. But I think we need that here too in the UK. And I think the larger, less expensive, reliable workforce is actually us, it's the patients. The most transformative thing that I think can happen is to find a system that actually empowers people to take more control of their health, to manage the increasing number and duration of long-term conditions that we're all going to be working with, to have the information and the tools that allow us to do much more of the care ourselves. That, I think, is not the same as saying that the patient is just going to be the consumer, and I think there are some very interesting questions about whether the consumer model is the right one. I think we would all benefit from healthcare delivering much better customer service and giving us more information and more control. But I'm also very interested in the paradigm of patient as partner, working in partnership with clinicians and with the system to make joint decisions about what the best care plan is for myself and for other patients. And I think we mustn't forget the notion of patient as citizens with rights of access to healthcare, and to be cognizant of the huge inequalities that I mentioned. So I think we can see huge innovation potential. Some of it will be technological. Some of it, I think, is about changes of attitude and mindset in the way that the healthcare system, say in this country, does its business, moving from a traditional paternalist model to one that's much more participative, and where we really need to see huge innovation, not only in the use of technology, but in service design. So I think, Chris, you commented on hospitals and communities. Actually, one of the biggest changes we need to see is shifting the centre of gravity of healthcare away from hospitals and much more in the direction of primary and community services, where actually most healthcare is delivered but is underinvested and doesn't provide the wraparound support that people really need. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Well, let's give the panel a good round of applause. And now for the next 19 minutes, you are going to have the opportunity to put questions to this panel that has demonstrated a very wide range of views based on this afternoon's lectures. Janet.
Thank you very much. Thank you from Bradford. There was maybe one topic which wasn't probably mentioned right in here, and that was about preventive medicine and how do we actually prevent this particular problem that we are going to deal with. And the other issue which really probably is related to this, and it's about the amount of information. There's a big data project that everybody talks about, and then there's the whole question about, even in my age, when I don't consider myself to be old, I'm being overwhelmed with information. I'm handling it. And that's part of the aging phenomenon. And really on top of that is if the aging population does increase everywhere, except for a few countries, the consumer, the ability to purchase for the aging population is also different from non-professional who's actually got a large area.
I would like to lead off. Is this one for you, Chris, to start with?
Which Chris?
Yeah, there's some very interesting things all bound up together there, and I'd like to speak on a couple of them if I can. One of the things that worries me about the model that will be entirely patient-led and patient-focused is that some patients will need help to take control of their healthcare, and I think we will probably need to consider how the patient plus carer is better involved in their care. And for many of you, if like myself you've just been dealing with the issues of elderly, frail and eventually demented parents, you'll know just how very much important it is to get engaged with the health carers for your parent. And I think we do need to have that model at the back of our minds when we're getting very enthusiastic, quite rightly, about smart technology. that for some individuals that will actually become a burden for them, or something that they can't engage with, and they need an agent to act to help them.
Sorry, go ahead, Chris. Sorry, I interrupted.
I was only just going to mention this question about the big data issue, and that's where I would just come back to bioinformatics, just to mention that actually the first stage for us is to roll that out to deal with genomics and genetics. Step 2 next year is bioinformatics for the physical sciences, and we hope to be recruiting a cohort of people who will have both physics engineering skills and IT skills, who will be dealing with some of the very large amounts of data that we expect to be gathering from monitoring of patients in hospitals, live monitoring through these smart systems and so on.
Chris?
I'll just say something about not very big data, but an issue that's been put to me. Because I wasn't necessarily saying that what I was talking about was all good. I mean, my point was it's going to happen. If we don't do it, somebody else will. And one of the points that was put to me was that your doctor, particularly in the States, may not welcome you turning up with reams of measurements of your blood pressure for the last 2 years, saying, "Doctor, what should I do?" Because of the concern that if he doesn't plough through the whole lot and subsequently is found to have missed something, he's liable to litigation. So I think, and that's not very big data, that's megabytes, not terabytes. And I think there was a counter-argument. I mean, what I was saying was this change is going to happen because in some way, technology is going to end up on our pockets and phones, going to be generating all this data. There are a lot of practical issues about how it's used that could be damaging rather than desirable. And the worried well is actually a very big example. You know, I just measured my blood pressure and it was 2 millimeters higher than yesterday. Doctor, what's wrong with me? Stop wasting my time. But that's another 10 minutes gone. So I think there are a lot of issues around this torrent of data that's going to come out that affect the service hugely.
Peter? Sorry, Jeremy.
Yes, I was going to say, I mean, the information overload is a real problem, and what is sometimes couched as the problem of the worried well, I would couch it differently, as the availability of information, the ability to quantify yourself creates the risk of magnifying anxiety and uncertainty. And a lot of healthcare, we often talk about healthcare outcomes in particular ways. We don't talk about the outcome very often being the reduction of anxiety or the management of risk and uncertainty, but a lot of healthcare is about that. And so I think as we move into a world where it becomes easier to quantify oneself, and that can bring huge benefits, I think we're all going to have to get smarter, health professionals and patients, about how we understand and manage the risks and uncertainties around data and stop ourselves becoming a nation of hypochondriacs.
If I could just make a comment on the preventative thing. I mean, based in the Department of Public Health at the University of Birmingham, we're very conscious of public health programmes. So as part of our remit, if we came across an effective public health programme, we would feed it through to our variety of customers. And also related to preventative, but not exactly the same, would be our work we do on screening technologies. So we work closely with the UK National Screening Committee, who are now part of Public Health England. So we're constantly looking for new screening tests that are coming through, which obviously aren't about preventing disease, but they're about catching it earlier. So we do have an eye to that issue.
Professor Travanti?
So I think there are some very good clinical examples of preventive medicine. So starting again from my specialty, you know that the UK now has a screening program for all males aged 65 to detect abdominal aortic aneurysms. So all males at 65 will be invited for one ultrasound scan, and if your aorta is less than 5.5 centimeters, there's nothing to do about it. If it's 5.5 centimeters, you will be treated within 2 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks. So that is, I think, a very strong message out there that we're putting this into practice. There is, of course, there's a whole different branch of medicine now, which is predictive medicine, which sits alongside stratified medicine. And with the advent of the genetic testing, we have very predictive markers of breast cancer, for example, and a lot of people who get the test done, genetic testing done for breast cancer, they are offered a variety of prophylactic measures, quite significant measures in some instances, but they are offered. There is also a lot of screening programs around other mitotic lesions like colorectal cancer. So I think preventive medicine, as the diagnostics gets more sophisticated and the biomarkers get more specific, then I think the preventive medicine field will advance hand in hand. I think there needs to be greater investment in longitudinal studies. We have a great amount of money put into short cross-sectional studies, But if you look at the Framingham study done in the United, now we're the grandchildren of Framingham, and we have learned a huge amount from studies such as that, and we can pick out people who are at increased risk of diabetes, cardiovascular disease, stroke, etc. So I think there is hope there.
Yeah. Right, another question from the floor? I'll go down the port side here. This gentleman.
I'm Chief of the University of Bath. We've heard a lot about costs, but I haven't heard anything about reductions in procurement costs. I understand that's a major cost of the NHS. Anyone comment about the possible use of technology to reduce the procurement costs?
Well, I think Peter did touch on, or sorry, Jeremy touched on, I will call you Peter, Jeremy.
You can go
Jeremy,
fine.
you did touch on pharmaceutical costs, I think, or prices.
Yes, I did. It was an observation that, there's a whole debate to have about that. I'm not an expert on procurement, but it seems to me there is something quite powerful in going with the grain of the general tendency for technology to become better and cheaper. And maybe the answer. So there's a difficulty in people often say it's really difficult to get the NHS in particular to adopt innovations, and it might well be that that's the wrong place to look. That we should be doing more to encourage ordinary people to adopt innovations that can be used for health purposes, and then require the NHS to engage with those patients who are using those technologies. So that's a different model, and I'm just making this up as I go along. But I think we should be suspicious of any long-term trend which takes us in the direction of more and more and more cost, because that would tend to imply we're doing something wrong.
Alison, have you a view that?
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm at the other end, a bit too early to be worried about procurement where I am. But I would say that from our discussions with the industry, and we talk to hundreds of companies per year from all over the world, they are aware of the strain that the NHS is under, and they're very much trying their best to bring things in at a price that can be afforded. So the industry is very aware of the stresses that the UK is under.
Yep. And Chris Gibson, you must be close to this one.
Having been very closely involved in medical equipment procurement for a number of large trusts in my professional life, I can say we don't make a very good job of it. And it's not through lack of trying, it's partly to do with the inherent structure of the NHS. We talk about ourselves as the largest employer in Western Europe, but in fact we are many hundreds of employers, and we are too fragmented, I think, for that. I think there are some hopeful signs, though. You possibly know about academic health science networks. These are groups which have been set up as part of the latest NHS reorganisation. Their purpose is to put all hospitals into networks coalescing really around the major academic centres. And part of their role is to roll out best practice, it's to roll out innovation, and I am hopeful that they will also be of value in the procurement of medical equipment area.
Yeah. Any other observations on procurement from the panel? Otherwise, we'll move to the next question, which there was a lady, I think, trying to, or I miss? No, it's the eyesight's going, I think. Was it this gentleman? Yes.
Brian Kent, hello. I'm the chairman of a number of SMEs, and I'm also an industrial advisor to venture capitalists. Our point for the Royal Academy, I think, Chairman, is there are not enough members of SMEs here today. If this meeting was taking place in California, more than 50% of the audience would be from industry. Yep. So whether or not we've done the invitations the right way, I think should be checked. But I'd like to see a lot more SMEs in this audience. Just a point about this mobile phone. Safaricom in South Africa have made a lot of money out of micro banking. And they've done it through the mobile phone. And a lot of the Maasai warriors have now got mobile phones. The bad news is they walk out 12 miles a day to get it charged now, which is very good for the heart. But I think we can learn something from what Safaricom did with the mobile phone. However, I think if you did tell a Maasai warrior what his blood pressure was, he wouldn't know what it meant. I think the point was made earlier. We have to be very careful of people understanding the information you're going to give them, because it can be dangerous. And I got a telephone call last night from my sister-in-law, who's just had a blood pressure monitor purchased for her, and she rang me up. She said, "What's it going to read?"
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think there are a number of issues that have come out. Finally, in my venture capitalist hat, I rated the first 3 presenters in terms of risk in which we would invest in. And it's interesting that the last one was in fact the lowest risk because it used low technology, existing proven technology, and it had been in business 100 years. The middle one, in fact, I rate as the robots, and the highest risk, I think, was from Leeds University. So therefore, the way I look at it is, what is the risk? Whether the reward would go with the risk, I don't know.
Yeah.
But it's been a very wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, you must feel a lot better than yeah. You clearly can do business together. Chris, I think we're going to come back to you on this one.
Well, I think it's not just the mass I worry. I suspect most people will be scared or wouldn't know what to make of the numbers. And it's another point that, one of the things we've been trying to do, as it's become clear that what we're doing looks as though it works, is things like today, trying to talk to people in the medical enterprise to say, what are the implications of this? And one of the big concerns, I said this earlier, is that if you put a load of data into people's hands, they will be scared, they will overreact, they will not understand it. And we have, I think, that the people who are developing, like my company, developing these technologies, have a duty also to provide the support that it's used sensibly. So, we're looking at an app that controls this bit of technology. That's got to do more than just say your blood pressure is X. It's got to say something about safe bands, and we then get into interesting regulatory issues because we're now starting to be diagnostic and not simply measurement. But if we don't do that, then it's irresponsible, and the point, Lionel's point, it won't get used. We actually want to do something useful. So I think that is essential, and it's not just the mass side. They're pretty shrewd. I think it's everybody, and I have to say that
very fit.
Yeah, they are fit because they walk. But I think that the point about the mobile phone is that an analogy I've used when trying to sell this to venture capitalists, that I didn't buy the phone I've got with a camera in it because I'm a photographer. I bought it because I expect a modern phone to have a decent camera.
Yeah.
And our business case, admittedly, is based on the fact that in 10 years' time, you ain't going to buy a phone that doesn't measure your blood pressure, because it won't be a proper one. Even if you don't use it, you'll expect that. I've got a GPS in my phone. It doesn't mean I get lost all the time, but it's just that I expect it. So I think we have a huge danger that it will become the norm. The phone companies are desperate for a differentiator. Why should I buy an iPhone 5? My 4 is just as good. I've got to have something new. They're looking for novelty, and I think they will latch on to the novelty of medical technology, and then we have to worry about how it gets used.
But you're back to Lionel's fundamental point about how the challenge is to educate patients if you give them data.
We have one rule in my company. It's a very small company, so we can have one rule, and that is if any of the staff refer to the person who's going to use our product as a patient, they have to buy the beers at the end of the day.
I see.
Because part of the cultural change is actually the move that I was talking about is towards users, consumers, who are saying, no, I'm not a patient, I'm not sick, I just want to take charge of my health, it's about well-being. So we're very careful about that word.
Interesting. Well, I could see some differences that you might well emerge if we stayed on here long enough, but I wonder if we should go to Jeremy.
I can't now remember what the question was.
So then we'll move on. We'll move on to I think Chris Gibson.
No, sorry. Can I just? I mean, the whole thing about information
You can
support.
come in later, and feel comfortable about it. It's no problem. You want? Okay, go now. Yep.
I just want to echo what the other Chris was saying about the importance of support going alongside information.
Yeah.
And I, as I said before, I don't entirely agree with the notion that we're moving from the old-fashioned paternalist notion of patients to consumers, because I think healthcare is not the same as shopping, and so the consumer model, I think, is only partially right. I think people do want to be in a position to be in control of their health, What we don't want to do is to create a new way of enslaving people to technology and to screening and to figures and a general sense of anxiety and getting onto the career ladder of being a patient as a result of all the new technologies we provide them. So I think I also echo Chris's comments about the risks in this area.
Yeah. Chris Gibson?
Well, I think a helpful distinction for me is a distinction between monitoring a known condition and diagnosing one that doesn't or may not exist. And so if an individual already knows through their healthcare investigations and their own care that they have a condition, monitoring it is going to be no problem at all. And we're already seeing lots of people doing that for blood glucose levels for diabetes and INR for people on long-term warfarin and similar conditions. What worries me about the diagnostics worried well thing is if you look at what's happened with screening tests, it's very, very difficult to take a very low prevalence condition out there and screen for it. And even if you do something incredibly well established and incredibly carefully controlled like breast screening, you still take a very long time to show benefit. And you've got to worry about the false positives. There's going to be lots of those in a low prevalence condition. The false negatives, because there'll be some of those because the test wouldn't have been used right. And I do worry about the idea that we're going to allow people to, quote, diagnose themselves with these things. I'm very comfortable about monitoring.
I think it centers around education. We've got to educate these people to be aware of what they are measuring and what the interpretation of that is. Because we could unleash a whole new array of data, which in itself is not detrimental. But I think the reality is that people get anxious because of the numbers they see. Then that is not really going to be helpful. So education alongside technological advances is absolutely mandatory.
Well, I think unless there's another burning question, I'll take one more. We're right on the time when I was going to invite you all for a glass of wine, but if you'd like another question, we can take that as well. So I think the gentleman, no, the lady? Yes, I'll go for the lady. Yeah.
Hi, I'm definitely a lady. Janet Davies from Imperial College. I've got a bit of an interesting background, so I'm a bioengineer by training, but I now work in public engagement. And it's been alluded to throughout all the panels. But I think what I want to see the panel's view was on public engagement in these innovations and medical technologies and how important it is.
I think that's a national health question to start with, so we should probably go to Chris Gibson to start with.
I think the NHS has been quite poor about public engagement in the past, but what I see at the moment in terms of the new NHS is a very, very different attitude from everybody through commissioners, NHS trusts and all levels of the NHS system. In terms of technological innovations and how they should be influenced and improved and enhanced by patient engagement, we've heard a lot about that today, particularly from some of the early speakers about how you involve patients in either focus groups or developmental groups, and I think that's absolutely crucial. From my own perspective, which is perhaps a bit more at the moment about education and training, we're involving patients in the selection of people who want to be trainee scientists, and although some of them don't know this, we're involving patients in the assessment of them when they reach the end of their training. Not their scientific and engineering skills, of course, but all the other skills that go into making a good healthcare professional. So I think the NHS has got some way to go, but is definitely improving.
And I think many of the major organisations such as NICE and the HTA, the Health Technology Assessment Programme in Southampton, all the big organisations now have quite strong PPI strategies. So I think they are very much embracing the engagement of public and the patient.
Jeremy?
Yeah, I think the recognition, the importance of engaging patients and the public has definitely gone up the agenda, and it's been one of the undercurrents of the NHS reorganisation in England. I think our observation as a coalition of charities that work in this space is that there's still quite a lot of room for improvement, and there's a gap between the rhetoric and the reality, but I think things are getting better. I think for me there's a fundamental distinction between informing and educating the public and consulting the public, which I think are part of our old-fashioned ways of doing it, and what some people now call co-production or co-design, working with communities to get the products and services right by building in the customer insight from the outset. And I think that's a different model of engagement, but there's a growing evidence base that that's more likely to lead to better products and services, and that's the way I think we should be thinking about public engagement in the future.
Chris?
Okay. I can only endorse very strongly what you said. I mean, one of the purposes of what I was trying to say today is if you like to do an alarm call and say when these sort of technologies become readily available, it's even more important that we've got an engagement where people understand what they mean. And it's only going to make the problem harder or more important. So strongly support what you were implying.
And Professor, we're going to give you the last word.
Well, we've seen it permeate all levels. We've got patient engagement when we talk about new therapies. For example, wound care, we have a large diabetic limb salvage unit in Leeds. And when we discuss new wound therapies, we have patient advocacy and patient engagement incorporated within that. Also, I alluded to one of our NIHR program grants, which again has patient advocacy built into it, and we are mandated within that grant to meet with the patients and the community twice a year during the grant. And on the several committees that I sit where we adjudicate on grant applications, there is often members from that particular area of expertise, whether it's cardiovascular or diabetes, on the grant panels. So I think we've seen that the patient engagement is indeed being addressed. And I think this will continue to grow and be very effective in the future.
Well, thank you all very much indeed. You've worked extremely hard as a panel. You've given very valuable responses, and I think we should show our appreciation. And just to say a few words before closing, first of all, to thank you all for taking the time to be with us today. And I do hope that you all valued this opportunity to come to this, of a series, by the way, of innovations in, and today it was medical technology industry. The series has been running for some time. It's something I was very keen on initiating, and that we've had to date, we started with innovation in construction. We then moved to innovation in business systems. We had innovation in the auto industry. Today, medical technology, and in November, we have one on new materials, innovation in materials. I want to say a huge thank you to all our speakers today. I think they did a superb job. It was great to see medics and engineers together on the same stage. There will be a short report of the proceedings of today published later in the year, and that will be available to everybody. But personally, I find today's seminar, it really underscored for me the widening bandwidth of the application of engineering, and certainly this seminar today really underscored that for me, of the various areas that we are now engaged in, whereas those of us who studied engineering 40 odd years ago certainly would not have had the opportunities that we heard about today. And it's fantastic to be, for our young people in particular, to be engaged in solving some of the world's human problems alongside the medical profession. The other thing for me, and I hope for you, is that the speakers really highlighted for me today that innovation is alive and well, particularly in medical technology. And I trust that our enterprise hub here that I spoke about earlier will indeed get alongside a number of the researchers in this field, because biomedical technology and biomedical industry, to me, seems to be an area where the UK can indeed lead and succeed and build. Whatever way we like to cut the cake in the country, we are going to live increasingly by innovation and by our intellectual horsepower. And to deploy that in areas as valuable as medical technology seems to me a wonderful way for us to contribute to growth. So thank you all again for being with us. Thank you again to our panel and to all our speakers. And now we can offer you a glass of wine or refreshments downstairs, and there's also some exhibits that you certainly should also see. So thank you all again.